I don't read a ton of slim volumes of poetry, individual slim volumes of poetry. I tend to read more collected poems or selected poems or anthologies, or to read individual poems here and there by various poets as I kind of investigate their work until I maybe decide to read a collected or selected poems by them. But I have read a decent number of slim volumes of poetry, and I just got done reading one volume of poetry that I think must be certainly one of the most powerful, if not one of the best, that I have read. And that is Birthright by George Abraham. So this was published in, let me look it up very quickly, it was published in 2020. And go me for reading not only a book that was published recently, if not a new release, but recently at least, and by a poet who is still alive and who is actually quite young. George Abraham, I believe, is in their 30s. George Abraham is a Palestinian American writer. They are also gay, I believe, and also, I believe, non-binary. And my sense is that they accept both they, them, and he, him pronouns, because in the author bio in this volume and online, when I've seen their work discussed, I've seen them referred to intermittently as both they and them and he and him. I am going to default to they, them, just because that's what I'm comfortable with, discussing someone who identifies themselves as non-binary. But so this volume, again, by a queer Palestinian American poet. I believe George Abraham may not have been raised in Palestine, but his parents certainly were from Palestine, and if what is in this volume is to be believed, they have spent a lot of time in Palestine, and this volume deals a lot with what Palestinians experience in occupied Palestine and in Israel, the way that they are treated, the Nakba, the ongoing genocide, which its current manifestation in Gaza was not occurring when this was published, but the themes still hold true to what's currently going on, and so on and so forth. So this volume deals with a lot of different things. It deals a lot, like I said, with the experience of Palestinians in occupied Palestine, but also with being Arab American, with being of Arab descent and living in America, as well as what that's like when they travel to Israel, and for Palestinians who live in Israel. But then a lot of the poems also deal with being queer and the intersection of being both Palestinian, American, and queer, and in George Abraham's case also non-binary. And so it makes for a really fascinating and powerful collection. Something that I want to start out discussing about this volume is that it's very unconventional in the way that it's organized. So there is a table of contents in the front. Hopefully you're seeing that right now. There's a normal table of contents with the poems listed in the order in which they appear in the volume. But if you go to the back of the book, there's kind of an alternative table of contents where George Abraham kind of encourages you, rather than reading the book in a linear fashion, to kind of branch out in all these different webs of associations between the different poems. And so you've all these nodes here are names of poems, and they're all connected in different ways, right? So you could go from this one here, perhaps, to that one, or to that one, right? You can branch off in many different directions and sort of put the poems together and take them apart in many different ways. So George Abraham kind of encourages you to read the poems in this sort of non-linear fashion. And I will say I did not do that. I started the book at the beginning and read it all the way to the end, in part just because that's how I usually read books, and I could imagine myself on a reread trying to read it according to one of these paths. But for a first read, I just wanted to get the poems as they're written in the order in which they appear, And I imagine this will be a book that I purchase a copy of and own so that I can revisit it and read it in one of these alternative readings. But so it's a very different volume of poetry from what you're used to reading, because you can read it in this nonlinear way. And as I'm going to show you, there are also some poems in here that are really experimental in really cool ways. I often myself find poetry that is like aggressively experimental to be kind of pretentious and off-putting and not very moving. But the really experimental poems in here are pretty cool, and I'm going to show you one in particular. But to start with, I think a good introduction to this volume is to just read you the first poem in the volume. And a lot of the poems in here are on the lengthier side, so buckle in for some readings. But I am going to read you this first poem in its entirety, because it is a great introduction to the power of a lot of these poems and to the subject matter that it deals with. And so this first poem is called Taking Back Jerusalem. And it starts with an epigraph by Mahmoud Darwish, who is, my understanding, is widely known as the sort of poet of Palestine, sort of the poet laureate of the Palestinians. He died, he's not alive anymore, but he has a very esteemed standing in Palestinian literature. And so the epigraph is this: I said, you killed me, and I forgot, like you, to die. So that's just the epigraph. So I'll go into the poem now. So this is Taking Back Jerusalem. Let me be brief. By the end of this, someone will be cursed, and I pray at anyone but him. Him is done with an uppercase H. Let me start again. The night was beautiful, but not romantic. Sure, there was smoke and moonlight. From this angle, you could almost mistake the city for American. There were 7, all of us born of this country before this country existed. It was ours the way a street cat is mothered by thin air. Still, we called this a reclamation, a taking back, the sign reading cameras in use outside an unlit jewelry store. The palm trees dancing like they could belong here. City of gravel, throat, and temple's cry. Of gold-blessed forehead and confluenced histories. How many waters anointed and claimed you, inheritance? How many hands unsanctuaried you by birthright and conquest? A name, however holy, can be a story of unimaginable distance. We could only exit you by the mouth through which we entered, and there we first saw him. And him, once again, uppercase H. We first saw him, shadow folded in shadow, speaking hushed and hurried Arabic. And for the first time that night, a familiar I could but couldn't have known. A boy with moonlit tongue promising his mother he'll make it back with every breath. Peering around the corner, a soldier, his gun, that precise smallness. I couldn't unsee him or him. So one of those hymns was lowercase, the other one was uppercase. I couldn't unsee him or him, couldn't uncast that smile from his nodding face, our mouths pretty with English. He stopped one of us, and searched only one of us. And there I remembered my mother, begging God to watch over us in Jerusalem, where at 4 years old, a soldier held a gun to her head, and maybe it was or wasn't at this exact spot, and maybe she prayed for the wrong son, but in that moment I prayed. And there was no God but the space between us. How the distance between my holy and his holy could resurrect a broken Lord on my breath. And there I began to understand how my mother could abandon her birthright. And I suppose she made it out. Alive, depending on your frame of reference. And so did we. And by some magic, so did that boy, caught with the wrong God on his breath in his holy city. Forgive me. I'm trying to understand what makes one's existence at a fixed location a radical act, divine even, and what makes the existence of another, near a specific body of water, a violence. Forgive me. I wrote this in an American airport, and its magic escaped me. So that's the first poem. And so a couple things leapt out that I didn't necessarily mention before, which another theme that emerges in this collection is religion. George Abraham, my understanding is actually his family is Christian Palestinian, not Muslim. There's, of course, a widespread stereotype that all Palestinians are Muslim, which is not true. There are quite a few Christian Palestinians. And his poems deal with religious ideas, although I do get the sense from some of them that George Abraham may have lost their faith. I'm not entirely certain, but I get that sense from some of these poems. But anyway, that's a good first taste of the collection. I'll read you a shorter poem now. This poem is actually the first section of a longer poem, but I'm only going to read you this first section. And so the long poem is called Inheritance, a Translation. But this first section that I'm going to read you is called Song of Ash, Haifa 2016. And so here is Song of Ash. Philistine is burning. It is an obvious metaphor. For God so loved the colonized, he sent us to hell with our oppressors. For God so loved us smoldering, he birthed us unto ember topography, holy, leaking light, hardly a metaphor at all. We were first settler, intruder, who dared dance on holy land as if it could ever be ours. Then we were terrorist of jealous stone and flaming tar. And now they paint us arsonist on our own land, and we're exile, combustion, flying rage. And isn't that headline worthy? We're trending and worth attention only in anger. Where were your tears and hashtags when the fire spread to the West Bank, when Gaza combusted again? And in August, and in 2014, and in 2018? Isn't history hardest to read in reverse? Isn't it hardest to digest in repetition? Isn't cremation hardest to digest when human? So that's a Song of Ash. Also, those last three lines, isn't history hardest to read in reverse, and so on to the end, those are actually written in reverse. They were actually printed from right to left. And that actually happens a couple times in this collection, where there's one poem in particular with a large section where the words are printed right to left instead of left to right, which I assume is to kind of mimic the way that I believe both Arabic and Hebrew are written right to left. One of those poems is actually one of my favorite in the collection, but I'm not reading it for you because it would be really hard to read because I'd be reading it backwards, basically. So you're going to have to read that poem of your own volition if you pick this collection up, which I, of course, urge you to do. But so another poem in here that really leapt out to me was one called A Broken Gazelle Before Balfour. And so this is a ghazal, Ghazal. I'm not sure I'm actually pronouncing the name of that poetic form correctly. It's a classic reader's dilemma where you've only ever read the word, so you're not quite sure how to pronounce it. But it's called Broken Gazelle Before Balfour. And the epigraph to this poem is actually the Balfour Declaration from 1917, in which Arthur Balfour basically put it forward as an idea that the British Empire would try to facilitate a Jewish state in what was still then Palestine, which was still 95% Palestinian and not Jewish. So the epigraph, this is what the epigraph reads. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Okay, that's not the whole Balfour Declaration. I think that's only part of it, but the Balfour Declaration is very short, so that is probably more than half of it. But the poem itself is interesting because it actually is made up of fragments from the Balfour Declaration. So here is this poem. It being clearly understood that the gazelle was not always a border between extinct and endangered. It being clearly understood that ground sumac and the heart of a pomegranate are proof enough that a country can coagulate in our hands. It being clearly understood that every image of Elysium came from somewhere, that inside every heaven there is an earth we've mourned the loss of. It being clearly understood that wandering itself can become a type of home. It being clearly understood that there was never a Palestinian people, came from the mouth of a settler who, when asked, "Where are you from?" replied, "Chicago." It being clearly understood that the settler's father was, quote-unquote, Palestinian, by his own definition. It being clearly understood that, in his childhood, Sido would wander the streets of Jerusalem with his Jewish neighbors every morning. It being clearly understood that they fell out of touch. It being clearly understood that, while the gazelle is the most Palestinian thing to write about, I've never seen one. I'm starting to think we made them up. It being clearly understood, mythology. It being clearly understood that Israel's right to exist. It being clearly understood that, when our cathedrals and mosques were burning, there was never anything to mourn. It being clearly understood that our churches were built before their ancestors' knew Christianity existed. It being clearly understood that the church will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that this object, which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing in Palestine, it being clearly understood that Palestine, it being clearly understood that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in any other country, it being clearly religious, it being clear, understood. So, at the end there, you saw the poem kind of start to become increasingly fragmented and kind of broke down at the end, and that's a common occurrence in this collection. The lines in this particular poem that really stick out to me are near the beginning. It says, "It being clearly understood that every image of Elysium came from somewhere, that inside every heaven there is an earth we've mourned the loss of." So Elysium is taken, my understanding, is from Greek mythology, where Elysium was a really pleasant part of Hades to be after one dies. So it's sort of the afterlife. It's a little bit like a heavenly place for the dead to live. And what I think he's saying, or how I read those lines, is that every paradise that one person thinks is a paradise was once someone else's paradise that was destroyed. And you can see in that the stealing of Palestine from the Palestinians by the state of Israel, right? Israel now being the quote-unquote paradise for certain people, but having been created on top of land that was stolen from Palestinians. So those lines kind of stuck out. But that's Broken Gazelle before Balfour. Okay, I would like to read... I have 3 more poems I want to read. I'm not going to read all of every one of these poems. The next one I want to read, just the first section of, is called Cartographies of Light. And this is a very long poem. It's 1, 3, 5, 6 pages long, with very long lines. And it's really powerful, but I can only really read you the opening because it's just too long for me to read all of it. But I will read the first part of it. So this is Cartographies of Light, and the first section that I'm going to read to you is called Miracle of Holy Fire, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, 162 CE. CE being 80, for those who don't know. So here's that. The angels overlooking Jerusalem are weeping light rivers into goblets of wine and blood over the body split, casual and made ritual of. The candle leaks itself, alit, transfiguration of molten flesh resisting night. In the sanctum, shapeless and bluing hues defy their plasmic origin, praying not to human spectra to redefine their optic censure. God's eye shining down upon his empty tomb, come prayer light, come miracle and flicker of hollow womb. Listen, the distinction between holy and heresy was always a question of fire. The distinction between whore and saint lies in who's burned for it. The distinction between martyr and false god lies in whose testimony is set ablaze. The distinction between Eden and exile lies in the tip of a sword on fire. My God, a resurrection always to end in flames, holy, the fire refusing to burn. So that's the beginning of Cartographies of Light. I wanted to read one poem that dealt a little bit more with George Abraham's struggles with... It sounds like some of the poems in here are about their struggles with their love life, and some of those are really powerful as well. I maybe will refrain from reading it because I think this video has been going on a really long time. But the poem I was going to read to you is called To All the Ghosts I've Loved Before. And this one is actually interesting because the first word or first couple of words of each stanza make up verses from Hit Me Baby One More Time by Britney Spears, which I didn't realize the first time that I read it. I didn't realize it until I read the notes in the back. There are some notes in the back of the volume. And I really love that. I've always really loved when so-called high art sort of engages with so-called low art. So poetry being perceived as a very quote-unquote high art, whereas a Britney Spears song probably most people would view as quote-unquote low art. And so for them to incorporate verses from a pop song like this into a very serious poem about what sounds like a very serious poem about unrequited love. George Abraham, it sounds like, had unrequited love for a man. And that sounds like what the poem is about. I'm not 100% sure, but anyway, I thought I would describe the poem a little bit to you all. Maybe I can read the ending to it rather than the whole thing. All right, so I'll read you the last few stanzas of To All the Ghosts I've Loved Before. So here's the last 4 stanzas. Hit me like the brakes you never wanted to press down, that bend at that speed, pole vault me into a lackluster lover, exhaust me into serenade, and surrender, disrespect me like a run-on sentence. What's the point of want if it isn't full throttle? Beg for me and I'll call you. Beg for me and I'll call you air. I want you to breathe me. Baby, one word for you that never felt comfortable in my mouth, despite the synonyms for you. Babe, BB, B, Eb, Habib, baby is a boring I cannot afford. Give me a queer love so mundane it doesn't have to kill me. More the flocking of sparrows, less the drifting of... You ever look into a man and see a wilderness? You ever look into a wilderness and see fire, soot and eyeline? This and every ecosystem could exist as fine without us. See the dandelions shedding tiny countries adrift nowhere? See the daffodils, wide-mouthed, unbecoming, that and everywhere? Time as a focal locus of and against control. Time as not space, as elegies sprawling. Admit it, we all need a framework of anti-mirror. I have never looked into a love song and seen myself. Every poem I enter leaves me seen and anything but. Listen, I am trying to tell you a story about distance. So that is the ending of To All the Ghosts I've Loved Before. Another thing you're probably noticing about George Abraham's poems is a lot of them kind of end on a very ambiguous note. They don't end with a lot of closure. Similarly to how some of them sort of break down at the end. In fact, there's one poem in the collection where the ending is just sort of becomes so jumbled that it's more noticeable than in any other of the poems. Maybe I can find it quickly and just show you what it looks like on the page. Give me a split second to search through this. I hope I find it quickly. I know it's in here. Here we go. Yeah, so you'll see on this side, you've got proper lines, right? And then over here, it sort of breaks down, right? So that's kind of what I mean. But anyway, the last poem I want to talk to you about is one of those aforementioned, as I said with love, aggressively experimental poems. And so this is a poem that's in 3 parts, and each of the 3 parts is really odd in its own way. The poem is called The Ghosts of the Exhibit Reveal Themselves, Triptych. Okay, so it's got 3 sections. The first section is called Into the Lines of Kufiat We Stitch Our Generations. The second part is called Into the Lines of Kufiat We Stitch Our Generations Post Bullet Holes. And the third section is called Into the Lines of Kufiat We Stitch Our Generations Cento or Cento. I'm not sure. That word is spelled C-E-N-T-O. Again, the curse of the reader. I'm not entirely certain how to pronounce that word. But I'll show you the poem just to show you how different it is. So here it is. I sure hope you're seeing that because I can't look at the camera right now. But so in the first poem here, so in the first section, you've got variations on different verses. You've basically got different phrases and words, and you can kind of follow the linkages between the different phrases and words to create your own poem, right? Although you can't really create your own poem completely because you have to follow the paths that George Abraham has kind of set out for you, right? So my first impulse was to start up in this upper left-hand corner, just because I think as a left to right English reader, that was where my mind first went. And so I could create a poem that goes like this. I could say, I don't have a word for my love where I'm from, just the skeletons dancing from death unwritten, existed, unwounded, whole and of ash, for river lived, digestible or mistaken for blood, inherited in a language, my gender, a word for my, well, okay. Yeah, so, but then I could start in the bottom right, perhaps, and go, unwounded and whole of ash, for river lived, perhaps I never, in Arabic, digestible, I'm not sure. I'm not doing a very good job of this, but when I looked at this, I thought it was really powerful. I mean, you can also, you don't have to start in one of the corners either, right? I could go with, start, for example, with my gender, right? My gender in Arabic, dancing, winded, where I'm from, my love, I don't have my country inherited or mistaken for blood and birthright of sin, right? So anyway, you can go a lot of different directions. And then the second part of the poem, which you probably can't see very well on the camera, this second section is really the same thing, but with some of the words and letters blotted out so that they mean different things. So the phrase I don't have becomes I have. The phrase my gender just becomes my. The phrase whole and becomes just whole, as in like a whole, not like whole, like being whole. Let's see, of ash becomes just the word ash, and birthright is totally blotted out. Okay, so anyway, that's what that is. And then the third poem here is the one that I explored the least. But again, it's a similar idea to that first one where you can kind of branch off into different poems. But anyway, this was one of the most powerful and eloquent and thought-provoking and fascinating poetry collections that I have read probably ever, but certainly in a long time. And it is by a Palestinian American author. So if you are looking to read or support Palestinian authors, I can certainly recommend this book. George Abraham, as far as I know, has not published another full-length volume yet. They have published one chapbook, although I think that chapbook contains a lot of poems that are in here, so it may not necessarily have anything that you wouldn't get by reading this. But anyway, I highly recommend this volume. It's really powerful, and I think this video has probably gone on long enough, so I will leave it at that and talk to you all again soon. Bye.